everyone, and welcome to Lecture 3. This one is about Elizabeth Gaskell and Arthur Miller. So its writers separated by about 100 years. Elizabeth Gaskell writing in the mid-19th century and Arthur Miller writing in the mid-20th. I've themed the lecture around ideas of activism, realism and witchcraft. This lecture is really the one in the middle of the module that moves you towards thinking about the present and moves you towards thinking about the way that witchcraft has become a matter of activism. The witches are, on the whole, innocent. The identification with witches is a matter of personal taste, if you like, and it's also a matter for activism. It's a matter of identity politics. It's about defending those people who were accused of witchcraft, trying to empathise with them, trying to place ourselves in their position, rather than, as in the first week particularly, writing as a demonologist and attacking those people, scapegoating those people, or, as in the week on Macbeth, in writing fantastical literature about them. This isn't so much imaginative literature, fantastical literature, fantasy, gothic, and so on that we're talking about here. This is rather different. This is a week about realism, to a large extent. The texts that we're looking at are not wholly realist. There is always some element of romance in them when magic is involved particularly, and we'll see how they've departed from the historical record, how they've done their own imaginative work with the text that we're thinking about. But in both cases, they did think of themselves broadly as realist writers, and I want to talk about what realism is, how it relates to activism, so how it relates to placing yourself in the position of the innocent victim of the witch, and how it relates to witchcraft. So if we go on to the first slide, I want to start with a definition of realism. This one is from the great 19th century writer Henry James, an American writer, but often writing in an English or European context. And he wrote an article called The Art of Fiction in 1884. James was an arch realist, and he's useful for defining realism because he's so absolutist about it. He says, the only reason for the existence of a novel, this is his primary form of activity himself, but he's also writing as a critic of other novels, is that it does attempt to represent life. That's a big claim, really. The only reason for the existence of a novel is that it does attempt to represent life. So there's no other reason. A purely imaginative piece, an abstract piece, something symbolic, that doesn't represent life in the way that James thinks it should, that's somehow illegitimate in his view. So he thinks of literature as inherently realist, inherently realistic, as attempting to represent life as it is. And he also talks about historical realism. He says the subject matter of fiction is stored up in documents and records, and it must speak with the assurance, with the tone of the historian. So any idea that you might admit your fictionality, you might address the reader in your own voice, you might say, well, this is just purely a fiction, a play. You might break the fourth wall dramatically if you like. It's a betrayal of a sacred office, a terrible crime. This really is a realism which is about commitment to trying to represent the world around us. Of course, there are some problems with it. One of the things that James goes on to say is the author can only speak, as he puts it, the truth. Of course, I mean that he assumes the premises that we must grant him, whatever they may be. That's a very clausy sentence, isn't it? There are a lot of commas here, and it's kind of opaque. Note also that the author is always male here. This tends to exclude the truths of women, the realities of women, and witches are often women. So writing about witchcraft in this frame is really quite hard from the outset. Also, of course, writers tend to be white, they tend to be well educated, they tend to be wealthy people. All of the perspectives that do not fit into that grouping tend to be excluded from realist fiction in this period, per se, by the very nature of needing leisure and money to be able to write full-time, for example. So there are some massive problems with James's definition of realism. You have to ask whose realism this is, what real world is being represented, how is that reality being defined? What if somebody else's reality looks completely different? Do they get a voice? Do they get to write fiction? Maybe they don't. But the idea of realist fiction lies at the back of what both Elizabeth Gaskell and Arthur Miller, and many other of the writers that we're looking at on this course as well, are doing. They are attempting to represent the world around them, But also, I want to move on to us thinking about how they want to change that world by their representation and how they set about doing that. Let's move on to the next slide and think about Elizabeth Gaskell, and she'll be the subject of this first section of the lecture. So Elizabeth Gaskell was born Elizabeth Cleghorn. She lived from 1810 to 65, so she was born before the Victorian period, but she lives right through it into the mid-years of Queen Victoria's reign. And one of the most important things that happened to her, as with most Victorian women, was marriage. It was the change of name, it was the status of a married woman, and moving forward really to being a mother, to being a matron. That was what was expected of Victorian women. In Elizabeth's case, she marries a Unitarian minister called William Gaskell in 1832. They have 4 surviving children. One dies in infancy, and that is a terrible tragedy for Elizabeth, and she reacts to that in her writing with a sense of increased empathy for the suffering of others, and she's quite explicit about that at the time. I want to talk as I go through this section of the lecture about her understanding of empathy with others and how it really stimulated her as a writer, both thinking about realism and thinking about activism as part of that. Her major works, the period of her flourishing, her floreat as writers tend to call it, is about 1848, which was a year of revolutions across Europe, was a radical year, and I think prompted her in her concern with social realism, to about 1865, shortly before her death. And her major works are novels, Mary Barton, Wives and Daughters, and she also writes a non-fiction work. And the subject is interesting. She chooses another major female writer. So she writes a life of Charlotte Bronte in 1855. Remember that Bronte had to masquerade initially, or chose to masquerade initially, as a male writer, or as a writer of neutral gender that could not be guessed. So Elizabeth Gaskell was interested in that gendering that Bronte chose, and she was interested in the ways in which women's voices were silenced in Victorian culture. They could not speak as women to the extent that she wanted them to be able to do. She chose to write under her own name, and she chose to make a claim for female writers by doing that. At the same time, she's also interested in people, in characters in her novels, but also people in the real world around her who are not like herself, are not female, but in particular are not wealthy, are not comfortable, are not living comfortably as she was as the wife of a minister. She writes about the people in the streets of Manchester around her. So her husband has an urban parish. He supports a lot of working class people. And because this is Manchester, they're often working in cotton mills, they're working in factories. Some of them are working in mining and sewing industries, in the fabrication of clothing, all the provision of the materials that go towards powering the factories. So, for example, coal. And she writes, I bethought me how deep might be the romance in the lives of some of those who elbowed me daily in the busy streets, and this is of Manchester. I had always felt a deep sympathy with the careworn men tossed to and fro by circumstances. And she wanted to write about, as she put it, the injustice and unkindness which they endure from their fellow creatures, the agony of suffering without the sympathy of the happy. You can feel in that her own sense of empathy, her own sense that the tragedies that had occurred to her, the difficulties of her life, were ones that she thought were relatively minimal compared with the sufferings of others, but which had informed her own identification with those suffering people. And I think one of the reasons that she comes to write about Lois the Witch, she comes to write about witchcraft, is because of that sense of empathy, the sense of activism that goes into that, the sense of wanting to change the world and make it better for others. She starts off with men, interestingly. It's fascinating that she does not start off with female characters. She starts off by thinking about working class men, the people that she meets on the streets. But this is a novel called Mary Barton from 1848, which does also address the condition of women in Victorian society. If you want to think about these novels in a particular form, firstly you can think about realism, and you can think about how that applies to Lois the Witch. But also you can think about Elizabeth's works as being social condition fiction. It does take the form of a traditional romance plot often, so there's perhaps a love story, or there's some kind of conventional genre narrative that underlies it. but it takes great pains to combine a pointed realism with that. So to describe the conditions of the poor, to describe the disadvantages of women in Victorian society. And another example from this period is George Eliot's writing. So for example, Adam Bede, Middlemarch. If you want to read Gaskell alongside those sorts of fiction, she fits in very persuasively to that genre, I think. She's also influenced very much by Unitarianism, so this is another important context for her work. Unitarianism was and is a particular Christian sect which has a great emphasis on social work, on outreach of social kinds, and on social reform, which includes, of course, political reform and political activism. And Unitarians, particularly in this period, were also interested in greater religious toleration. So those are important contexts for when you read Lois the Witch. Gaskell's first novel, Mary Barton, which I was just talking about, does in part address male political activism. So this is about gaining the vote for working class men. But it also talks about injustices to women, prostitution in particular, but also the general expected passivity of women. She then goes on to write Ruth in 1853, which is a very controversial fiction in its time because it has a fallen heroine. So somebody who has become the mistress of a rakish male character in the text, who conceives a child out of the expected wedlock of the Victorian woman, and also even attempts suicide when she's abandoned by her lover. So she's fallen in the full Victorian sense. She's lost her virginity, she's lost her social position, she's lost her self-respect, and she's lost her desire to live. She's a tragic figure in that sense, but Gaskell wants to write about her in order that we understand Ruth, just as we understood previous characters in Mary Barton. She goes on to write lots of other fictions about groups of women, Cranford, Wives and Daughters, for example, and they often deal with a relationship between the ideal womanly submissiveness expected of the Victorian woman and the piety and charity that goes along with that. And on the other hand, the unjust subjection and the passivity that these women are forced to endure as they are often exploited, their interests are often overlooked. In some of the novels, this is relatively minor. It's trivial stuff, but it's painful nevertheless. These are women squeezed to the margins of their own lives and forced to remain silent about the injustices that happen to them. As a minister's wife, she does tread a very fine line here, I think, and you can also see that in Lois the Witch as well, I think. She treads a fine line between different versions of the Victorian woman, and her activism is limited. She is limited in the way that she describes her characters, the way she positions them in relationship to other characters. But nevertheless, she is trying to make a difference. And when she comes to write about witchcraft, I'd like you to think in this first exercise on the next slide about how that works. So look back to the idea of inversions and binaries that we've looked at in the past 2 weeks and think about how Lois the Witch as she becomes, is or is not an ideal model of femininity. How did the other female characters in the text relate to her? And is there a message here? What is the message for women? What is the message relating to witchcraft? And how does it relate to the ideas of social activism and realist fiction that we've been talking about so far in the lecture?